Hey everybody, welcome to Written and Watched. My name is Justin. I'm going to be your host. With me today for World War Z by Max Brooks is Sean Fitzgerald. Sean, will you introduce yourself, tell the people a little about where they can find you, and what brought you to bring World War Z? So you've got a couple of things to do in there.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Sean Fitzgerald. You might know me as SS Fitzgerald, the author of Sinner's Past and A Fold to Extinction. I'm an author of horror and sci-fi horror. I wanted to do World War Z because I'm a huge fan of the novel. And as you'll hear from my movie side of it, very disappointed with where the movie ended up being from the novel, but we'll get there. You can find me at ssfitzgerald.net, or you can find me on Amazon and Books A Million.
Yeah, we'll put links in the descriptions and we'll put links in the show notes so you guys can find him really easy with just a click. He's extremely well reviewed in all those places. People are very excited about his books. I have not read them yet, but they're now on my agenda since I've met him. When I first saw your name, all I could think of was Steamship Fitzgerald. Is that an inherent result of is Sean and then your middle name's got an S?
Yes, my middle name is Spencer.
Gotcha. That's pretty clear. So today we are going to focus on the book side of World War Z. And on that, you want to tell me your first experience with the book, what was your place and position when you were first reading it, and how it first impacted you? Because for me, this is a reread, but the last time I read it was more than 10 years ago, like probably around 10 or 11 is my guess for when I read it.
You're making me feel sad because I feel like this book is still brand new, and you're right, it's out there now. My first experience actually wasn't with World War Z, the novel. I found the Zombie Survival Guide, which is kind of an in-universe survival guide that actually shows up in the novel itself. And I thought it was at first a gag gift, and I read it, and it has like legitimate survival tips in it. And then from that, I found that he wrote the book after the fact, and I went out, bought World War Z, probably at the same time period, 10 years ago, 9 years ago, and just fell in love with it. And I've read this book now probably 6 times. It's just one of my favorite zombie books, and it's one of my favorite horror novels.
Yeah, it's interesting because the Zombie Survival Guide was actually written, and if in interviews with Max Brooks, he talks about writing it and wanting it to be categorized as like self-help and not fiction. He thinks of it like a post-apocalyptic survival primer, like it's kind of the same response no matter what is happening, and the zombie's just kind of a catch-all for whoever the opposing or force you're resisting is, which I found fascinating.
Yeah, I have quite a few survival handbooks. I have a military background, so I have the old manuals that we use, and there is legitimate survival information that he's included in there, and so I was just super pleased when I got that as a gift, and it wasn't just a gag gift.
So weirdly enough, I for a while I was doing domain name arbitrage, which is kind of a stupid thing to do, especially now. If you didn't get it in like the 90s, it's really hard to do. But one of the domains I had was zombieprep.com, and it to this day is my most successful arbitrage. I sat on it for about 3 years, and I sold it for just under $2,000. So in the end, I made like $1,500 off of that website, and it was a company that was like making zombie camo. It was kind of neat. They're not around anymore, but they were there for a while. So with what we said so far about Max and kind of his couple of books, it'd be rude of us to not point out that Max Brooks is Mel Brooks's son. Like Mel Brooks, the guy that, yes, that Mel Brooks, and his mom is Anne Bancroft. So he's the oldest of their children. And the original pitch for the Zombie Survival Guide after he'd written it is his agent was walking around going, oh yeah, Mel Brooks' son wrote a zombie satire, and it's such good satire that he never breaks. So if you read the Zombie Survival Guide, it is 100% in universe. There's no sly push-outs, and it wasn't written as satire. It was written as self-help. And so that publishing track came on the back of his family legacy, which I think is really interesting, especially with what World War Z is. Do you want to describe the novel a little bit, like how it's structured? Because it's a super cool structure. It works really well.
Yeah, and this is going to be my biggest crux with the problem with the movie as well, is the novel doesn't follow a central character. It's I believe the central character or narrator is never actually named.
Never named.
It's a reporter. Exactly. Okay, I'm good. I'm happy I didn't miss that. A reporter goes around and interviews survivors after the zombie war is pretty much already over. And every chapter is a different survivor telling different segments of the outbreak. So chapter 1, early stages, there's a handful of them out there, and how it starts in China and rural outbreaks. People don't believe it. And it just progresses all the way to the point where, we have New York under siege and zombies are just overwhelming humanity. And then the flip side, humanity pulls together, comes back, establishes normalcy in some areas, and then are able to fight back from there. And then there's a little bit of the recovery right there at the end as well.
Yeah, so the whole structure is in the family of what's called epistolaries. And I learned about this when the first time I ever heard about it is Dracula. The book Dracula is an epistolary. It's a series of newspapers, articles, and interviews with people that all kind of overtly tell the story that's underlying each of their narratives. And so in World War Z, I started at the beginning to try and track how many there were. And after I realized they were shifting like every 3 to 4 pages, I'm like, I'm not going to track 100 different people. Because he just goes, he clips, he goes, zip, and we got them, and zip, and we got them. And they're really nice, tight little vignettes. And he's really good at shifting the voice from character to character. Not only in...
Definitely.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say definitely a strength of his because is it all right if I share a little bit of spoilers?
Yeah, no, spoil everything except the movie because if people want to listen to this, then go watch the movie and then come back and listen to the other one. That's allowed. Yeah. But if you're listening to this one, you should have read the book. If you didn't read the book, stop, go read the book, come back, or spoil.
Exactly.
Your problem.
Yeah, you're missing out if you haven't read this book. There's a chapter where he speaks to, I don't want to say she's mentally challenged, but she's developmentally delayed. And you could feel that he's talking to a mentally younger person that is in an adult body. And you could hear that in the interview.
Yeah, and that one's weird too because he describes her as being like really attractive and just like a dancer's body and then brain of a 4-year-old. And then just dives into this interesting kind of conversation with her. And it's very much, it sounds like it's written more from a very childlike point of view, but with a strange capture of memories that she can almost voice. And I was confused about that one. I had 2 takes on it in different times I read it. The first time I read it, I took it at face as she has a developmental disability. She is stuck at that age. But then when I was rereading it this time, something in the opening description struck me, and that was that she was an anomaly. So in it almost feels like she may have gotten bit, and that's what regressed her brain, but something in her kept her alive. Which read did you get? Were you on one side or the other? Or did you? I don't even know if I'm just seeing things here.
I did not take it that way. I think I might be confusing that chapter with the one where they talk about the zombie PTSD, where people start feeling like they're zombies.
Got it. The Quislings, right? Where they call them Quislings, and they're people that are running around. Yep, I know what you're talking about. Ding. Yeah, two different sections. So this is an idea of how prolific it is that there's so many stories that you can get characters conflated. So you're talking about the one where people decide that they're zombies too because of a mental break and start running around and acting like the zombies.
Yeah. Maybe I'm misunderstanding it that those two, the girl and them might be related where that, because she mimics the zombies at one point in the chapter. And he says, this is why they keep her separate from all the other, is because she can hit the moan so realistically that those who have other forms of PTSD can't be around her anymore. So I took it as she had some level of that PTSD that the others had.
Interesting.
But she was able to revert back to her childlike behavior.
Gotcha. So the manifestation of that psychological break for her kind of came back and released her enough that she could be a 4-year-old is where you took it.
That's how I took it. I might be completely wrong. There's probably a litture doctor out there that's going to come back and tell me I'm completely wrong. And the shades in the background were her depression. I don't know.
And that's fine. If you're a literary doctoral student and want to rip on us, feel free. We'll welcome the argument. I was confused the second time I read it because I thought that her stuck as the 4-year-old. Because this disease, the disease that underpins the whole book, has 100% infection rate. Everybody that gets exposed gets infected. And so I thought for a minute that young lady who was in her 20s but mentally was 4 was somebody who had gotten bit and had some kind of a resistance. And so I thought that was one of the places they were going to try and make a play for a cure. But they never really make a play for a cure in the text.
Yeah, that's one of the beauties to this is it completely skips that trope of zombies or looking for a cure. The cure is we win the war.
Yeah.
That was the cure.
And in talking about like the disease itself and how they deal with it, do you want to run through like what the symptoms are, how kind of it manifests, and how it kind of transmits from person to person? The Solana virus or the Solana
You probably would be a little bit better because I reread this when I first reached out to you.
Okay, so it's been about a month. Okay.
Yeah, so the first couple chapters are a little running.
No worries.
But I can remember the first couple chapters, especially when it's in rural China. There's reason to believe it's not a zombie virus yet. So he builds it up that it's a very rational response that the world takes to everything. It's not until the doctor walks into a hut and he thinks that these people are just extremely sick that somebody like breaks his arm and shows no pain to it, and he starts crawling after him. And then when the doctor, a little bit further ahead, different doctor, is at a nightclub and he's getting a call and they're like, we have this patient that's just psycho. Like we had a high fever and all of a sudden we don't have anything on him. You need to get here now. The doctor shows up and he has an ungodly large handgun with him, and that's the only saving grace that hospital has that day. Specific symptoms you're going to have to touch on because, again, it's been since I touched on it.
So I thought this was a really interesting way to go about it because they make the zombie-ness manifest in a very similar way that 28 Days Later is, and that's that this infection causes an overwhelming drive to consume human flesh. Like that's what you want to do is eat people. And with that being the overriding goal, you contaminate other people when you bite them. It's carried in the blood and saliva, open wound to open wound, and that's how you contract the disease. And once you're exposed, there's no like ifs, ands, or buts. You're going to get it. There's not a chance that you're not going to get it. And the people infected, while we call them zombies, Zeds, Zeeks, ghouls, Siafu, I don't know if I'm saying that right. That's the Japanese term for them. But whatever they're calling them, it's just kind of a characteristic of the symptoms and in alliance with what zombies historically have been. Like it's not an actual voodoo zombie raised by black magic. It's just they present in a similar way. They're unrelenting in their onslaught, and they just want to eat human flesh. And that's kind of their whole thing.
Yeah. The George A. Romero tradition.
Yes. Slow zombies, too. I think that's a very interesting thing in this because a lot of the people are able to escape or get away or find safety because they just walk. But they are always walking towards you, which is a neat kind of ominous and kind of sinister evil. Because not evil, it's just persistent.
And I think we see that best in the Battle of Yonkers, one of my favorite chapters, by the way, in the book. Throwing the full weight of the American military, dropping bombs on top of them, and the soldier explaining, like, modern munitions are made to do things to a living creature.
Yeah.
So when you have that concussion, it goes off, the body doesn't pop like it would for you and I if we got hit by close ordnance, right? And the zombies are just walking through, and he goes, and you hit them with all these heavy machine guns, you cut them in half, and they just keep crawling. It doesn't stop them. Shock and awe doesn't work on the zombies, and I think that's exactly what you're going at.
Well, I think there's a really neat there's so many threads in this that he does really well, but one of the threads he does in this really well is how the warfare against the zombies changes and how the munitions and resources of the militaries change. There's a chapter with an F-22 pilot who's talking about how useless she feels because she's a fantastic pilot. She's in this F-22. It's so good at flying around, and she is wholly ineffectual against the zombies. There's nothing to be done from an F-22 against zombies. And the warfare has this slow regression from high-powered, high-stakes, eliminate collateral on the other side to kill them one by one in the brain. You got to kill the brain. That's it.
My memory of the chapter alignment is a little wrong, so forgive me if this doesn't line up. But so we see the downfall of modern military, right, with Battle of Yonkers, the F-22 pilot, and then the military or the fight against the zombie, not necessarily the military, shifts when he starts talking like there's an ROTC unit at a college that they fought back with air rifles. And they're like, and then there's a castle out there that somebody used, and they were successful because of like old school siege warfare. And then it gets back to where the government is coming together and they're developing armor to be bite resistant. And then it's a controversy like, why don't you share what that armor is with other countries? And they're like, it's top secret. We don't want other countries to know how we did it.
Yeah, so they do. So I think that's the third thread of the book is the dissonance and disconnect between all of the countries to eventually at the end in the Saratoga when they come together and the UN is actually like deciding to fight. But in the thread you're talking about on the warfare and the munitions and the stuff, you're absolutely right in that the conventional warfare breaks down along two paths. One is the conventional warfare and like shooting cannons from tanks at things is not super useful. Grenades are not super useful. If the brain is intact, they're still going to use whatever limbs they have to come after you. And the progression comes out of this improvisational style that they develop in the U.S. military where they go, you know what? Any ideas are good ideas. We'll reward them all. And the Marines come up with a bunch of stuff, including what they call the Lobo, which is like a modified shovel battle axe that's really good at beheading and smashing brains. And that becomes like the primary weapon of the foot soldier of war is when all else fails, you don't need bullets for that. Because it works every time.
Yeah. I completely forgot about it. You're absolutely right. And then it might be that third thread again. They finally figure out like, hey, one of the best things to do because they just keep coming is to set up this area that's defensible and then just resupply it every single day and let them kill them until they stop coming. I think he does a great way of plotting our attempts to get there. Let's go back to like the very beginning. He even talks about the American Alpha teams when he's talking about South Africa and reestablishing the government. He goes, America tried. They did a great job with sending out these special forces units all around the country, hunting down. He goes, but they didn't want to bite into the second phase of the plan, which the Alpha teams were only supposed to slow the zombies down. Yeah. They were never intended to completely eradicate them. So then when the infection got out of control, they were overwhelmed. They didn't know what to do. I think he did a great job just plotting the downfall and the recurve of the military rising. Yeah, and that I think is really dependent on that third thread about all the politics, because you have the politics of China having the first outbreak and then having a fake conflict that they worked on with Taiwan. And so there's these other conflicts that are pulling all of this political and spy and CIA energy away from focusing exclusively on these things. And they have a really nice chapter with a guy that was in pretty high up in the CIA talking about their limited bandwidth and how they have to point it at certain things. And they get reports of outbreaks once a week. And so to think that this outbreak was more important than China and Taiwan having an issue or the submarines that have started to go AWOL, they make a really good point about how the politics kind of works in that. And I was really impressed with his ability to kind of pull that thread both for China and the US and then countries like Russia and Finland and England and kind of get a really good
take on what might be a plausible reaction that they had.
One of the biggest strengths is how worldwide he's able to paint this story. And it's countries that you might not even necessarily think about. So you mentioned Finland, but he does a great job touching on Israel and like what would the Israel-Arab conflict look like in the middle of a zombie war? And that was an insane chapter by itself. And then India, I think, has one of the most memorable chapters as well, like explaining people, just massive bodies pushing against each other. And then you have a massive infected bodies pushing behind them. It's terrifying to think about.
Yeah, so reading through this text and you start to hit where there's so much concentration of people, and the places he highlights in that are India, Japan, and then China he does a little bit, but it's not as concentrated as India is or as Japan is. And in both of the stories about those places, they end with somebody getting out because of being just a little bit more willing to cut ties and kind of cut away. In India, they're talking about how they're loading up the boats at the shore, and there are people on the boats that are going, no, we're only taking girls. And there are other people on boats that are going, we don't take anybody from the untouchable cast. Like they bring in the whole caste system and they're like, no, you're still untouchable. You're as bad as the zombies. Just stay here. And I'm just like, oh my God, he really got like the zeitgeist of some of this stuff.
And in that, he paints the horror picture too, because he's talking about people that are in the boats and the zombies are pulling them out in like shallow water, and they're being eaten like right there in the middle of the water. He does a great job of mixing that cast and the cultures of each area, but still making it a zombie chapter each time.
Yeah, and I think a large part of the horror for me in it comes from how much he describes the individual before they were a zombie. Like almost every zombie, he goes, it was a 5'6" white guy, and he's got no T-shirt on, but it looks like he was in running shorts and shoes, and his right eye is hanging by its stalk, and the visible bite marks on his arm. Everybody, almost every zombie he describes as a person before a zombie, which is really, really creepy.
And I think it's the Battle of Yonkers where he has that character say exactly that we have this mental image that they're going to come out like in their suits and they're dressed with. He goes, but people got killed when they're in the bath, when they're sleeping. So he goes, you'll get naked zombies, half-dressed zombies, zombies in, cheerleader outfits. You get a little bit of everything. And he goes, and there's a lot of naked ones because the weather is just destroying their clothes, but the body's still there.
Yeah, speaking of the decomposition thing, like that's one of the things that in reading it took me a while to get on board with, was the idea that this disease, it kind of congeals their blood so it doesn't flow like our blood does. They don't really need their blood. So while reading, that was one thing that seemed not supernatural but unnatural to me, is how long these bodies lasted with little to no fuel or sustenance, yet at the same time they just keep moving and letting their bodies decompose. Like they're around for quite a while as just a body. I think the first ones start really getting decomposed after like a month, so they're still active for about that long. And then in the far north you have the ones that freeze, and then every time it thaws they come back out of the ground. What was your take on that? Did that pull you out at all, or was that fine and it just kind of was another piece of?
I think a lot of zombie media gets dinged on that. So 28 days later, they had their answer, right? They said they're not really truly zombies. They're infected, so they starved to death after 28 days or whatever it was. It didn't bother me so much in this, probably because, one, it does take quite a while, depending on your climate, for the body to fully decompose to the point where nothing is going to work at all. I live in Florida, so we have the research center not too far.
Oh, you have the body farm? Oh my God, that thing's crazy. Tell people about the body farm that don't know what it is, because it's so weird that we do this.
It's so important, though, for crime. It's weird to talk about because it's macabre, but so important for studies of especially criminology. But to answer your question, it didn't bother me necessarily too heavily in this. I think what bothered me more was, and might just be Max's misunderstanding of nuclear warfare, is when the nuclear bombs are dropped in some of the areas, and they're like, well, now you have radioactive Zeds. Half-life for what it would do to a human body wouldn't necessarily make that infected dangerous to the point where I can't touch him because I'm going to get radiation poisoning. That's why, like Chernobyl, there's every year you can get a little bit closer to the reactor. Like, it no longer kills you just to walk near the reactor anymore. So I think that bothered me more than these bodies aren't decomposing, because just like you said, the northern zombies, they freeze. And he never gives a biological definition of what's going on in the body. So we could just say, hey, we just don't know.
Yeah.
Like this disease is so out there. Kind of like the Andromeda strain that Michael Crichton wrote.
I was just about to bring that up. Go ahead. Yeah.
It's like technically it's an alien life form. So anything's possible, right? We haven't found it yet. Doesn't mean it can't exist. But I didn't mean to steal your thunder.
No, that's fine. I was just going to just follow up on what you're saying, is that these gaps that Max has in the text about how it actually works and why that functions that long are the spot where it is our job to kind of fill it in, because it is science fiction. And so there's not necessarily a true or a right answer. And I think in Andromeda Strain, there are parts where they do themselves a disservice by overly describing the life cycle and how it changes and then how it's something else. Where in this, you're like, there's something in him that does this to him. Here's what we know. And it's all observational stuff. They never really like dive in and go, well, here's where it came from. And we're pretty sure it was from this animal and it modified from this particular virus. Like, they just kind of describe the symptoms and then take the whole, I guess it's like political science fiction, but they take the whole political and military and life cycle of humans and play it out from there, which is a smart choice.
Yeah, like unlike Crichton, who his method of sharing information is through an expert and exposition with that expert. We never get that person at the CDC who's like, this is all my job is to study this one disease. We never hear that person. We get a mercenary, we get a couple doctors, we get, the mentally challenged girl, all these other characters, but we never get that virology, or we never get the CDC guy, somebody who specializes in breaking that down for us. And I think that is, again, another strength of the novel. Yeah.
So the model that this is based on is there's this guy named Studs Terkel who did an oral history of World War II, and he just interviewed survivors. He also did a book called Working, What People Do and What They Think About It. And both of those are just people's experiences in their own words. And so what's really nice about that is that you're hearing their truth, and that's all you need. And then it's up to you to piece together the story that happens outside of that. Even from the firsthand accounts, that's not an omniscient narrator delivering the story of what happened. It's a guy going, here's what I remember. Here's how it was for me.
Yeah, and I think, going into World War II and just interviews with soldiers, and again, I have a military background, is there's the on paper right answer that people study. And the one I'll give you is, we heard in World War II, the Sherman tank was terrible, right? It blew up. They called it a Zippo. But the reality was it was good enough for what it did. Yeah. And if you look at the actual killed to destroyed ratio, it wasn't a bad tank. But the reputation soldiers had was, hey, we're being outgunned all the time. Yeah. And that is reflective in stories that you hear. Yeah. But we also know that the stories of Americans fighting Tiger tanks, there was like 2-3 engagements where we fought a Tiger tank. It was primarily an Eastern Front tank. So, American soldiers would say, oh, we took out a Tiger, and it was actually a Panther. And I think that's reflective in this, is that you get what that survivor experienced, and it might be wrong because memories are weird, and you have to take our knowledge of the situation and paint the picture, and that reader's disbelief is where you get to have a little bit of fun with stories like this.
Yeah, and again, Max I'm really impressed, because this is like his second book, but he writes each narrative and each story with not only a unique person's voice, but a culturally aware voice. Like, he's really good at writing Japanese and Finnish and English and like all these different, and South African. Like, he hits all these different kind of cultural bits, and it really feels like he's done a bunch of cultural research or reading to get kind of a grasp on this.
So I got to ask, what is your favorite cultural take chapter?
I was thinking about this too coming into it, like going back there. I was reading a bunch of Reddit threads. There's a Reddit thread that's like, what's your favorite one in World War Z? And I was reading through it and I was kind of like going, yeah, those are cool and those are neat. And I like a lot of them very much. And I like that they present different things. But there's one toward the later end of the book about a guy who, when he was a kid, was a spotter in Nagasaki and goes blind. And his whole narrative has nothing to do with zombie, like their physiology or how they attack. At this point, we understand that stuff all pretty well. But he's this old blind Japanese guy who, when this stuff starts happening, he gets this, it's like a stick from a shrine. And he gets a stick from a shrine and he starts going walking. And he's just walking by himself at night when there's fewer zombies running around because it's colder. And he runs into a bear and the bear doesn't kill him. And then he starts encountering zombies once in a while, and he trains himself to smash them like right in the bridge of the nose and pop their brains. And he talks about his battles and his fights and his struggles. And at this point, they're evacuating Japan. And when they're evacuating Japan, one person who's on his way to the evacuation spot comes across this guy, and he drops him. He's like, "What are you doing? Where are you going? Why are you here? Are you a zombie? Have you been infected?" And the guy's like, no, we're evacuating. Japan is over. We're leaving it. No, nobody in Japan anymore. That's the rule. And he goes, buddy, no, I'm staying. I'm staying here, and it's going to be me and the gods and the wind of Kami saving Japan for when you're ready to come back. You've got a sword. You want to hang out with me, and we'll take Japan back? Like, that was just such a human overcoming the odds. Even if they're gonna die, but even in the end, there's that resistance to fate that felt so human and so optimistic and so like what people do in those situations. And so that was the one that for me I really kind of I hung on. I was like, this is great. I just want to see a short animated movie of this guy. Like, they did that whole Animatrix thing. Like, do an animated series on this would be rad.
Yeah. This whole book, honestly, would do phenomenal in that format. Yeah, I'd have to say I'm really torn on some of mine.
Do you categorize them? Do you have like my favorite this one or my favorite this one?
I do. I really liked when you mentioned it already, the one with the mentally challenged girl, because nobody talks about. We always have able-bodied people surviving. It's like, what about the people in wheelchairs? They have one in this too.
There's that guy who's in a wheelchair and he's saved because the zombie grabs the wheel and it gives him about a second to turn with his gun and pop him. Anyway, go on. Yeah.
But I really enjoyed the one where they're in like I can't remember what country, Eastern Europe somewhere, and the tank crew is like trying to get everybody through, evacuating across the bridge. And they're like, I can't tell who's infected and who's not. There's too many people. And he sees that MiG bank in the upper end, and he's like, I know what that banking means. We have to button up now. And they get down, they close their hatches. Button up means exactly what it sounds like for those who aren't military. Close the hatches, and you turn on your NBC system, which protects you from radiation, chemical things of that nature. And they drop that nerve agent, and they just kill everybody in that road. And the lower enlisted, like, why did they just do this? They just killed all of our people. And then they start seeing the zombies get up, and it makes sense suddenly. Like, we need to stop the infection from getting to those who are already safe. And that was just I can imagine somebody higher up trying to make that decision. They're like, we either kill everybody who already escaped, or we kill the people that are trying to get away. And they made that call. That was a pretty cool chapter to me.
Yeah, the calculus of war is something that I've read a lot of fiction in that space, a lot of Heinlein, like he's very big in that space, but like that calculus of war and deciding what sacrifices to make, where to deploy, who to save, who to risk, that's just That's so much. I'm glad I don't have that responsibility.
Yeah, because I know you do movies as well. That to get people in, because I don't want to recommend somebody to read Heinlein, because that's a whole nother level. Like, I enjoy it, but I would never ask my wife to read Heinlein, because she would be like, "What did you just let me read?"
So quick bump. We're doing Starship Troopers for a future episode. So come listen to that one and you'll get a whole earful full of Heinlein. You don't have to read it. Come listen to us and then we'll talk about Paul Verhoeven and his satire. But dude, Heinlein's a lot. Heinlein, that dude is a grip of problems and crazy cool ideas, but he's also he's so structurally problematic and interesting at the same time.
It's funny on a tangent here. Yeah. My conversation when people are like, people don't understand the movie because it's satire. I always come out like, yeah, it's satire and it fails because the people who made the movie didn't understand the book, and the people who didn't understand the book usually didn't read the books.
Yeah.
But going back, just to say the calculation of war, that scene in Saving Private Ryan where Tom Hanks's character is saying, I have to make a decision. Mm-hmm. It's like, do I lose 10 guys taking out an 88? But those 10 guys saved 100 guys. So that 10 guys is worth it, right? Yeah. I have to make that decision every single day. And you see a lot of that in the book, especially from the politics side.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I'm just keeping my left eye on my notes because I know there's a couple things I want to touch on, and it's really interesting that they have early on they're doing a heart transplant with they're talking to a doctor who's hiding with the Yanomami who was doing a heart transplant, and the heart transplant was the source of the infection. But the weird thing about the heart transplant is that it's a harvested Chinese organ that they don't ask questions about the donor. And the big reason they had to have a harvested organ is because the person has situs inversus, which means that your organs are on the opposite side of your body. Basically, your genes, your Hox genes that say where stuff's supposed to be, were backwards. So your right lung's on the left side, your heart's on the other side, and all the stuff is wired backwards. Your liver's on the other side. Like it's just wired the other direction. And it's really interesting because it's something, the only reason I had heard of it is Catherine O'Hara from Schitt's Creek and Beetlejuice has it. So if you're ever up against a Catherine O'Hara zombie, aim for the right side of her chest because the heart's in the wrong spot. But that whole thing though, where he goes into this organ stuff and he talks about the donation and how you used to just pay the Chinese and it would show up, and so rich people use that column. It plays into this whole consistent manipulation of the governments by each other and by the way that each other's laws work, which I think is really relevant as we go into the next couple of years to see what happens and how our international relations work. Yeah, and
he also paints those early chapters with that ominous tone as well, because he ends it with, I don't know how many people I infected, because they didn't, at that point they said, like, I didn't care. He goes, I could have made 100 zombies and I haven't realized it. Paraphrasing, they didn't actually say that.
But it's in that vein. Like, a lot of that stuff is the Chinese government is doing it for political control and expediency reason. This doctor's doing it for capital reasons. So capital is superseding any kind of moral calculus. You have the smugglers that are getting people out of town, and they're like, yeah, we took the money. We didn't care. We took it. They could have been infected. We don't know. We just got them out of town. And the rich people, and talks about Flight 575, where at one point there was somebody who was infected, and that changes the way that international transportation and smuggling works. Like, all that stuff was so fascinating to show that the spread of the epidemic was really based on power calculation and capital calculation.
Yeah. And then because you brought up capital, there's one of my other favorite chapters, and it is the mercenary. He doesn't like to be called a mercenary, protecting the rich Hollywood elites at a mansion that's like zombie proof. Yeah. And they're live streaming it. I can just see it now, like TikTok.
100%.
You can see those videos of how it would look. And he's like, yeah. And then the people came, and he goes, at first we're like, zombies are here. They're running. They're not zombies. And then he's like, oh, there's people coming in. He's like, what, do we kill them? And ultimately he goes, no, because when they got in, they didn't hear murder them, steal the stuff, rape the women. They didn't hear any of that. They said, put the fires out. They just were people that wanted to live. And that's when he finally realized, like, hey, this is way worse than I wanted it to be. And I'm not going to stop people from just trying to live.
Yeah.
And he just gets on a surfboard and like paddles it out. Great exposition of just like the American capitalist system, taking a nosedive right there.
So I'll link it in the comments and in the show notes, but there was an article in The Guardian, and it was fascinating because it was exactly about this. And there was this guy who does a lot of writing about bunkers and a lot of writing about post-apocalyptic survival. And so he got invited to this super elite doomsday prepper rich people conference. And he went there and he was just talking to him. He was talking about like all the normal stuff, like, how where do you stock supplies? How do you make sure you have stuff to start growing food? How do you make sure, that there's not radiation? Like, what is all the stuff you bring in an Armageddon bunker? And past that, though, at the conversations at the dinner tables at night, when these rich people had had a drink or two, they start talking about how they're going to maintain their lifestyle and what they need to do to convince the people that work for them to come and work for them in the apocalypse bunker. They're like, well, we're really good friends. I don't see why they wouldn't still do this and just come and take advantage of being able to live, and then they can serve me still. And the disconnect between these people and their, I want to be pampered the way I am now after the apocalypse, instead of going, oh shit, I have so much stuff in this bunker. Why don't I just put a thing in place where everybody that I know and I like and is useful to me can come in there, and then we'll figure it out. But they want to maintain the way of life for them forever. And it's such a creepy article because you can tell how inhuman workers are to the uber rich. It's just like, oh, they're like, I have enough food. Yeah. Do I have enough servants? Fudge.
Yeah, a conversation I have with my wife every now and then is, if you consider I'm well off, if you consider the life we live, and I say, take a millionaire, like the baseline, he makes $1 million a year. Our lifestyle between us and him is radically different.
Yeah,
I said, but then the lifestyle difference between him and somebody who makes $100 million, light years different. And then take that and somebody who is a billionaire.
Yeah.
And so I say, when these people make these comments and people get outraged about it, we live in such different worlds that I don't even put any emphasis on it. And that chapter, going back to World War Z, there's that one, I think he's a rapper. He says he has a golden plated AK-47, and the mercenary's like, and he keeps going around telling everybody it's the gun from Scarface. He goes, and it wasn't an AK-47 in the movie, but I'm not going to argue with this guy because that's all he cares about.
Yeah.
We're so disconnected in the lives that we live. And I don't know how he did it. Max Brooks must be a phenomenally educated man because he hits all these different areas so perfectly in his writing.
Well, yeah. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is to compare a lot of the stuff that's expository or predictive in the text with what we ran into with COVID. And I actually found an Ask Me Anything from March 9th of 2020 with Max Brooks about COVID. Oh. It's fascinating. And I'll link it again, show notes, description, but it's fascinating because people are coming in and going, hey, there's these outbreaks all over the world. What similarities do you see? What do you recommend? What's your suggestion? And he starts going through like what he thinks would work and what different countries are doing. And at that point, it's like Taiwan was doing the best, like January, February, after China had the reported cases. Taiwan locked down its borders, made sure it had enough testing kits, and had a 14-day quarantine for anybody coming into the country. And so that kept their caseload down. The U.S. at that point, we didn't have enough testing kits. We weren't doing any kind of quarantine. And a week after that, March 17th-ish was when most stuff kind of went on you're working from home, your school from home. My nephew was at the Air Force Academy at the time, and that was the point at which they sent everybody home and said, go home, log in, we'll figure this out. Like everybody was kind of closing down. Even the military was doing shutdown stuff. The bases were starting to actually get probably the most secure lockdowns.
Yeah, I didn't get to read that section of it, but I'll tell you that personal experience with COVID. I was in the National Guard at the time period of COVID. We got activated and sent down south, and the National Guard, the state's probably going to sue me for this, so it's going to be fun. They just absolutely wasted money on us. So I was an infantry commander. Not sure if anybody knows what we do in the infantry, but medical stuff is not what the infantry does. Quite the opposite. So surprise, surprise with the infantry. So we sat down there, and they were like, well, you're going to assist medical facilities. Okay, what are we going to do? The first thing they said, you guys are going to seize respirators from hospitals. And
Jesus.
I also work in the military side, and I said, no. I was like, look, so I had to tell my colonel at the time, they were like, look, would you go to talk to the general, which we call the ATAG. So you're going to have to bring up two things here. One, the hospitals don't necessarily own all those respirators. If we could go on the corporate side of it and explain that. But so you're not truly seizing hospital respirators. You're seizing private company stuff from different areas. As a second, it's going to show up on the news, and they're going to have guys in uniform taking things out of the hospital and people who need it. And that's not the image that you want. So 24 hours, and we're sitting in a hotel, and that gets nixed. They're like, yeah, this is a terrible idea. So they're like, okay, you're going to go out there and help nursing homes and medical facilities, whatever demands they need. And you would think that with COVID, there's a lot of demand, but it's not for infantry soldiers. So we sat there for 3 weeks getting paid to sit in hotel rooms. And I had 4 missions come up, which sounds like a lot, but those missions were 24-hour missions, and they needed one person, and that one person did things like took out the trash, held the door open. And I was like, wow, so you had 40 dudes sitting in a hotel room, and I'm not the only infantry unit that did this. So where I'm going with this, to not to go on a COVID tangent, is the way that he paints like the government not knowing how to do things or like wasting resources in World War Z. Very realistic. Like, I can't tell you like how much money we probably spent moving our guys all the way down there, paying for a hotel room for every single dude, feeding him, and then just keeping them sitting there for not doing
So this is valid. I'd like to keep going with this conversation because I think the COVID comparison is the closest we've come to any worldwide problem that mirrors what he talks about in World War Z. And even in the Battle of Yonkers, when they're talking about like the deployment, he's like, yeah, they had like 40 porta potties all lined up for us, but there were houses with working plumbing everywhere. We didn't need them. It was all for press pictures and show and be like, look, we're taking care of everybody. Because there is that hunger in the populace to know that something is being done, even if it's not useful. Like, that's the whole security theater of airports. And I'm happy to fight the FAA on this one, but we have security theater. We have a presentation to make people feel safe instead of actually securing the airlines. Like it's the same kind of stuff.
2019. 2019, they did their test and they caught 1 out of the 40 bombs that they test bombs that they went through. Yeah, so it's 100% make people feel better.
Yeah.
I tell people that about when the National Guard gets activated for a hurricane. I say, look, the first 72 hours, they're useful. That's when you need your guys that get out there, clear debris, pull people out. I said, but the second you see a dude standing and handing out food, they're there just for press.
Yeah.
It's over as far as we're concerned.
Yeah. So to compare it to another portion of COVID and COVID response, one of the things that they talk about in the book that's really interesting is it gets called African rabies, and it doesn't start in Africa, and it's not rabies. Like, the reason they compare it to rabies is because if you look at, and if you want to look online, it's super disturbing, but advanced case of rabies in humans, they are terrified of water. They start to dehydrate. Their brain starts to freak out. And so they act in bizarre and inconsistent ways. Their aggression levels go up. Their frustration levels go up. And they're slowly dying, but they're dying in such a way that they're going to try and spread the virus. Like, that's how rabies works. That's why dogs get violent, bears get violent, bats get aggressive and do stupid things like attack humans. Like, that's there. And then they call it African rabies because in Africa, they actually like go, hey, this is happening here. What the hell is this? And everybody goes, oh, it's you. It's the African rabies. When it started in China. Like that's so classic worldwide bullshit is to just go, it's this country, it's that country. And there's so many. Yeah, go ahead.
With COVID,
yeah,
right?
the Wuhan flu. What is that? That's not where it came. It's just so, yeah.
Yeah, he does a great job painting that international picture. I'm just going to say that again. And I would say, the closest to a World War Z movie that we actually got that's true to the book would have been The Dead. I'm not sure if you've seen that movie.
But I'm going to make a note.
It's a very long. It's a very long movie. There's two of them. The second one's all right, but the first one, phenomenal. It follows a cargo plane that crashes in the middle of the zombie apocalypse out in Africa somewhere, and he ends up in the middle of a tribal conflict that's happening while the zombie conflict is happening. And that's probably the closest you're going to get to a Max Brooks World War Z. That being said, have you seen Max Brooks' response to the movie?
I haven't, but we'll cover that when we do the movie next time. Yeah. We're diving in, and there's still so much freaking stuff in the book. Like I literally have probably a dozen different points that we haven't even come to. Like the dirigibles, they have a whole dirigible corps towards the end that's for resupplying and redeployment. They have the Montana with the walled city. The whole idea of phalanx, which is like a vaccine, but it's not a vaccine that works. It's just it's a prophylactic. It's just to make people feel better. The dogs in the canine corps. Like we started talking about Starship Troopers. They have that equivalent here. They have these canine dogs that are trained to not bite the dead, but knock them down and alert and smell people to see if they're infected. Like there's so many good ideas in this book. You could take almost any of these stories and make a phenomenal film out of it.
Yeah, it's weird because the book's like only that thick. You would think that that's not enough to tell everything we're talking about here, but it fits somehow.
Yeah, and there's even a whole I keep looking at the list. I'm like, there's so much stuff. They have the International Space Station, and this was premonition back in when he wrote 2000. Was it 6 or 7? 2006. So in 2006, when he wrote it, this wasn't really a thing. But the International Space Station, they have to make this split where they aren't going to they have no launch capability. So you've got one ride back and more people than will fit on the craft. So there's like 3 people that stay on the International Space Station. They have like 24 days, 25 days worth of food and water. Well, the water's pretty okay because of reclamation, but food. Then they have like a Chinese shuttle that they scavenge for stuff. And then eventually, after stuff settles down, the first contact they make is with a private tourism shuttle that some like Texan is like, anybody order takeout? And pulls up next to him. It was like, and I thought that was really interesting that the private enterprise saves government remains as a premonitory thing. That's a phenomenal insight.
Yeah, I wonder if he met Elon and was like, "Hey, I got a great idea in case the zombie apocalypse." Speaking of that particular chapter, I think something that's great is when they're talking to the astronaut. He talks about how they were trying to just provide as much feedback to anybody who was listening. And he goes, the zombies are weird because they don't highlight this too heavily in the book, but the zombies will eat anything. Yeah. They prefer the humans, but he said that he watches one zombie find like a groundhog and just digs into the sand for 2 days and then loses it and gets up and wanders away like nothing ever happened. And it goes back to what we talked about earlier. They're relentless. Yeah. They just keep going until they find something better. Yeah,
and that it's weird though because it's when they're eating, it's just fuel. Like their body doesn't seem to heal like at all. They just get beat up and beat up and beat up and beat up. And even if there's just a head, it's sitting there going and trying to bite anything that comes near it. Like it's oogie. It's like ugh, bleh.
It reminds me of if you've seen all the George A. Romero movies. In Day of the Dead, they cut that one's head off and they hit it like right here, and the head rolls and the eyes are just going back and forth like as they run by. It makes me think. Yeah,
it's very much in that school. It's like he took that and went, okay, how would that actually work and got kind of a theory together for it, which is really neat. Oh, here's what I was thinking of earlier. Resource to kill ratio. Like that was the thing that they were talking about where they kept running out of bullets. Like they had great guns and stuff. And when they're shooting in like the Battle of Yonkers, they're running through ammunition because these things don't take a bullet and go, and stop moving and slowly die.
Yeah.
They need like 12 bullets and one of them's got to hit the head. And so they're running out of bullets and they start to do this resource to kill ratio. And so they're going like, okay, well, if we spend this money on this, will it get us more zombie deaths? And that's a really good kind of military calculus chapter where they're talking about that and how that stuff comes together.
Yeah, and going back to how the government wasted resources, I feel like we're beating Yonkers down. It's a dead horse. We're just coming back with a baseball bat every day.
Well, we haven't hit the brain yet, so we got to make sure that horse doesn't get up.
Exactly. I don't want it to walk away. He's talking about we had all these high-rise buildings and we didn't have a single rifle team on any one of them. He goes, why? We had them in trenches like this was World War I. And he goes, and you know what happened? They got in there and they started eating people. And I was going through training at the time period, so I remember this very real technology that they were trying to do, the battlefield system, where you can see what your buddy sees and you have a heads-up display. In real life, they said, hey, this is way too costly and it's useless for practicality. But in the book, it happens and guys see like people getting torn apart and they're like, oh, I'm done. I'm running away. I just watched Jeffrey get his throat ripped out.
Let's turn that off, shall we? I think of the Raid. Did you ever see that movie? I think it's Thailand where the movie's made, but it's like 6 to 12 cops raiding a building with a gang presence inside of it, but it's filmed phenomenally. It's all body cams. And so it's the person watching from the truck outside and kind of coordinating the guys over the headset. And I thought of that when they bump into that stuff. And it's like, that would be interesting and kind of traumatic. They do get into the PTSD. I forget what they call it in here, but they have people that are just like kind of give up and they either suicide or they just stop doing anything and just stay in bed until they starve. And they're giving up. Go ahead.
I was going to say, there's they interview the filmographer, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he makes propaganda for it. He talks about how people just go to sleep and they don't wake up in the morning. And that's a real thing. People actually suffer from that level of like depression that it'll kill them. Where they say dying of a broken heart, there's a actual disease where you can die of a broken heart. I'm sorry, I didn't steal
that's disturbing. I didn't know how real that part was, but it's problematic that it is. But in that bit, there's one part where he's talking to the interviewer. So the author has this little forward at the very beginning where he's like, we took all this information, we interviewed all these people, we put it together in a report, and the report was super sanitized, and it was left a whole bunch of this stuff on the cutting room floor. And I really wanted all these stories to be represented. And eventually his boss is just, write the book yourself. Leave me alone. You're allowed. I don't care. Get out of here. So he's like, fine, I will. And so this is that book. But every once in a while in the scenarios, you have his voice come through as a question and kind of answering and having a back and forth. And the propaganda guy asks him about a movie that one of his other people made. And he goes, oh, yeah, you saw that one? And he goes, yeah. He goes, did you see which version? And he goes, I didn't know there were two. And he goes, well, was it about 90 minutes long? And he goes, yeah. He goes, okay, there's another version out there that's about 2 hours long, and it bumps into a whole bunch of things with what this group did after and kind of their struggles. And that one didn't play so well. So they cut all this stuff about the internal struggles and made it more of a pure propaganda piece. And it helps reduce these suicides. It's like, oh, how bleak, but again, survival calculus and military calculus. This stuff is crazy.
I think he had to have interviewed people when writing this book that survived the Battle of Berlin. Yeah. Because if you go back and listen to people who went through the early days of the Battle of Berlin, it was very much like that. Like people they thought they were losing the war. They were expecting the Germans to hit the beaches. and, you know, propaganda, good or bad, it kept people in the fight long enough to come out on top. And he portrays that very well. There's that scene where he said, I made this movie, I put it out there, and I was expecting a standing ovation, and people walked out sad. He goes, but the next day, just like you said, like, we didn't have any deaths.
Yeah, he talks about like a 5% decrease and then a 10% over 2 weeks. Like there's a decrease in incidents, and it's specifically isolated in communities that have seen or had access to the film. It's fascinating psyops piece. And in something you were mentioning earlier, I'm just looking up because I wasn't sure if Max ever served in the military. I know he didn't serve in the U.S. military, but I was wondering if he did the return to Israel, serve in the IDF, and I can't find any evidence that he did. So I don't think he's ever had any service under command. But he must have been exposed to quite a bit of it, or his research lands, because there's so much stuff in this that rings true from my family's pretty military on one side. Like both my grandpas served World War II. Both of my uncles served. One was Navy and one was Air Force. And then my nephews, like I said, is went to the Air Force Academy. And so I've talked to them about how this stuff works. But beyond that, I have no idea. But you know better than I how true this sounds. And it sounds like you appreciate the waste portion.
100%.
The other thing that hit too, so there were two things that I do want to touch on before we kind of wrap this, and that's Max Brooks's his Jewish heritage is here in a couple of places. Like there's a question in here, and it talks about the Israel chapter talks about the golem and how those are made of clay and animated by magic. And so that kind of myth helps them kind of concretize an idea and put together this isolationist policy that serves them very well. And it's interesting to look at that isolationist policy because it actually embraces Palestinians. It reverts to the 1960s original borders lines, like after the 1967 war, 63 war. It turns to those borders, builds a giant wall around it, and it has this super secure enclave that then also allows Palestinians that were there to come back. And there's this huge internal fight in Israel between the conservative Orthodox group and kind of the more liberal wall building group who's letting this in. And I found that fascinating in light of the current stuff that's going on in Israel.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that stands out is he tells it not from an Israeli's perspective either. I think it's the Palestinians that's telling the story. And he talks about how when the internal civil war kicks off, he's like, I expected it to be my people. He goes, and I go outside and he's like, and it's Jews shooting at Jews. Yeah. And I think that's almost exactly what he says. Yeah. And yeah, it's a phenomenal piece. And it's surprising that he takes that stance.
I'm trying to remember. I think it might have been a Lebanese that got in too, because he was talking about being at the University of Khalil Gibran. But I'm not sure either. It definitely wasn't an Israeli, though. It wasn't them. It was somebody else. It was very interesting to watch that piece flow through. The other thing that hits on the class stuff is what is of value in a post-apocalyptic world. And there's two whole stories, one in Cuba, and then the other one is in, I think it's like Texas. But it's how all of a sudden all the people that are immigrants and picking the fruit and building the houses and doing plumbing and all these normally service jobs become more important. And all the rich people, when they get put into these safety camps, are like, okay, you're under one and you have to learn how to farm food. That's your job now. So there's this whole societal inversion that happens there and in Cuba that they touch on that I thought was just a lot of fun. Thoughts on that? Feelings?
Yeah, I think his words. He goes, we have this influx of white collar CEOs who are suddenly labeled as no skill labor, basically. He goes, and you go from a guy who had 50 plumbers under him to suddenly I have to now study from the plumber on how to be useful.
Yeah, it's really kind of a nice in the whole thing. Because you have all these people kind of discovering their uselessness throughout the course of the text when faced with something that is this monumentally catastrophic to the planet. And that's something that I don't think we fully picked up from COVID.
Yeah, and something we could say to our supply chain problem is it's a chapter near the end when he talks about what it takes just to produce pre-war root beer. And it shows the list of all the ingredients and all the countries it comes from. And he goes, of course, the supply chain caused a problem because look what it takes just to produce a can of soda.
Yeah. And he talks in that bit about World War II and how successful the U.S. was. And the U.S. was, at that point, able to be that successful because they had access to all of the raw goods for all of the manufacture they needed, from cotton to timber to steel to the plants that make it to the output of those plants was all in the U.S. of A. And so where the Axis is sitting there trying to figure out what to use inside of their borders, the Allies are just like, oh, we have the world to kick you with. So we're going to use this whole world and just kind of make tanks out of it. Even if they're not very good, we got more.
Yeah, you'll hear it here first. The U.S.'s contribution to the war was its mass production. That was the weapon of mass destruction, was just pure output. You couldn't kill enough tanks to. It's just what it was.
It's the same thing that Russia was able to do with people, both in the Napoleonic War and then when Germany invaded. You don't.
Yeah.
It's Princess Bride line. Never start a land war in Asia. It's a really bad idea. Your supply lines are bad and they have more people. So it's this whole thing, this whole text is great. It's totally worth a read. On kind of wrapping up talking about the book, is there anything we're missing that you really want to touch on that we haven't kind of?
We never really touched on the recovery.
Okay.
And the one chapter I'm going to talk about just on the recovery, is the two water chapters. So there's one with a Chinese nuclear submarine where they go rogue and they don't listen to the Chinese government anymore. And we have everything we need. We have a nuclear submarine. Yeah. All we need is food. And it talks about how they just survive out there until things rebuild. But my absolute favorite, and it's terrifying, especially if you have claustrophobia, is the oil rig diver who goes down, and he goes, and we didn't think about it. He goes, the zombies didn't care about water. They just walked. And he goes, so I'm down at the bottom, and there's TVs that he's stepping on, and all the old world that's just buried under the ocean. He goes, and you're in the darkness, and the face comes up, but it's so pungent on our waste as a society. He's making a statement there with that chapter. And I think that if anybody's listening to this and I don't know if I want to read the book, if you're not into zombies, he makes a lot of statements in between the subtext of everything about the way our society currently works. That, again, that's why zombies work so well, right? They're us at a consumer level, and he points all this out very well. It's very elegant. And I absolutely love that chapter, and it's terrifying. So.
I'm trying to find it because I was thinking about exactly what you're saying. So remember in Shaun of the Dead where they're able to hide themselves by acting like zombies? I think that might have been when I was looking at the stuff where there's the people who pretend to be zombies. There's this intimation in some parts of this that we are the zombies at the same time as the zombies are the thing we're fighting against. And that theme runs through it pretty well too. It's kind of so many people are just doing what they're supposed to do, or they're single driven by capital. They're singly driven by power. And that's a kind of zombie. If you're staring down at your phone all day, not enough to look up, as Shaun of the Dead implies, or if you're only focused on capital and don't care about anything else, that's a zombie kind of single-mindedness.
100%. And, he does a really elegant job of using, the baseline of what zombie is, what, you just broke it down, the statement that we're making there. And he does a really good job of dancing around and avoiding certain tropes. Yeah. So if you look at zombie media as a whole, there's always that the humans are the real bad guys. The zombies are just a figure piece. The Walking Dead's extremely guilty of it. I think just about every zombie movie is guilty. You have the raiders that are the bad guys that are more dangerous than the actual zombies. And he does touch on that at the very end, but he doesn't make a point of making that a topic of conversation aside from, he goes, we had a way of dealing with criminals, which was airdropping them into zombie areas, but then they became dictators. Like he goes, you came back to a nation of, Zimbabwe, and he has his own army, and now you're at war inside your own country. And he goes, and the scariest part was at the end of the zombie war when you see a tank again. He goes, because the tank wasn't used for the zombies.
Yeah.
He goes, I know what that tank means. And that's the only time he touches them. There's no extended conflict with another human race. That's it.
He leaves a couple of things in here that are counter to the kind of hope that's at the end of it, because the story kind of rolls through and gets to the point where there's a direct counterpoint to the Battle of Yonkers, where they pile bodies outside of a fortification 20 feet high and 100 feet out from the place, and they've been shooting for 15 hours on and off cycle. They've made these special rounds that burn when they crack inside the brain. They describe them at night. The zombies get glowing red eyes, but as opposed to Yonkers, we win. And so there's this hope at the end of the text, but that's all countermanded by seeing a tank for the first time, the walkers that are under the ocean, and then North Korea, which is just left as a dark spot on the map of what happened in North Korea.
Yeah, he has that ominous line, are we going to open a bunker one day? And it starts it over again, which is great because that's how he ends one of the chapters. But the very beginning of the book, he talks about how some people call it the first zombie wars. I don't like calling it that because that implies it's going to happen again. But what's even better is if you go back to the Zombie Survival Guide, outbreaks have been happening in cycles, and they just write it off as mythology. So it's this weird cycle that he's put up. But the entire premise of the book is hope, because you start the book knowing the war is over. That's the first thing he tells you. It's over. These are survivors from the end. But he sets this like cycle up so that mentally, like, it's not really the end. Time's going to go on and something's going to happen.
Yeah, it's really a fantastic text. I recommend it. Sean, do you recommend it?
Absolutely. If you're going to read any zombie book at all, this would be
I absolutely agree. I think it's phenomenal. It's a lot of fun. It's very joyful, and I think that you can even go through and mark when you're reading, and you come back and just read certain segments because they're totally different stories. It's almost an anthology. It is an anthology.
Yeah, absolutely. You can sit there and read a single chapter and enjoy it as a short story.
Yeah, because they sit on their own. They all have their own kind of rising and falling conflict and just kind of resolution. That's that story. Cool. So with that, Sean, do you want to tell the people where they can find you? Plug your pluggables.
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me at my website, ssfitzgerald.net, or you can also find me on Amazon and Goodreads. I currently have 2 novels out there, and I have a plethora of free stories on my website.
A plethora of free stories on his website. Everybody go there and read them. Everybody go read World War Z. We're going to be back next week, and we'll talk about the movies. I've never seen it, so this will be a first watch for me. Sean, you're not giving me hope.
Well, let me put this down. I am very picky about my zombie media, so I don't want to ruin it for you. Don't let me ruin it. But we'll talk about that next week, and you tell me if it lives up to the book.
Okay, fair. Thanks for listening, everybody. This has been Written and Watched. I'm Justin, and that's the end. So have fun. Go have a good week. Read something. Bye.